Hello, my effervescent children. Thank you for joining us today as we, not critique, but just overview, take a quick look at the opening to The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. So, I went around, talked to a bunch of people, asked them, what are some of the best openings to books that aren't like classics? Because everybody knows Call Me Ishmael. Everyone knows the opening to Tale of Two Cities. That's basic stuff. And this is maybe even a little cheating. This is, at least a lot of people have thought, this is one of the most famous openings of all time to a science fiction book. And as it happened, this was one of the ones that kept popping up. Everybody said, yeah, opening the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. In the beginning, the universe was created. This has made a lot of people very angry and been widely regarded as a bad move. And yeah, that's an amazing opening. It's hilarious, absolutely sets the tone of what is to follow. It's actually not the opening to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I swear, everybody I talked to believed that was the case. That sounded right to me. I thought it was. Then I picked up the book, opened it up, and that wasn't there. Turns out that's the opening to Restaurant at the End of the Universe, the second book. But was just so good. This line was what inspired our video today, so we at least had to read it. But it is not, in fact, the opening. So this text is the sample text from Amazon. So this is publicly available for anyone to grab, and is, as this is what the official channel is using as its preview, this is what we are going to use as our look inside our first few pages. Now what I'm calling a prologue was not labeled, so I don't know, I guess it could have been a preface, not a prologue. Not that there's a terribly huge amount of difference, it's effectively prologue. We'll start with there and go into chapter 1. Far out in the uncharted backwaters of the unfashionable end of the western spiral arm of the galaxy lies a small, unregarded yellow sun. Orbiting this at a distance of roughly 98 million miles is an utterly insignificant little blue-green planet whose ape-descended lifeforms are so amazingly primitive that they still think digital watches are a pretty neat idea. This planet has, or rather had, a problem, which was this. Most of the people living on it were unhappy for pretty much of the time. Many solutions were suggested for this problem, but most of these were largely concerned with the movements of small green pieces of paper, which is odd because on the whole it wasn't the small green pieces of paper that were unhappy. And so the problem remained. Lots of the people were mean, and most of them were miserable, even the ones with the digital watches. Many were increasingly of the opinion that they'd all made a big mistake in coming down from the trees in the first place, and some said that even the trees had been a bad move, and that no one should ever have left the oceans. And then, one Thursday, nearly 2,000 years after one man had been nailed to a tree for saying how great it would be to be nice to people for a change, a girl sitting on her own in a small cafe in Rickmansworth suddenly realized what it was that had been going wrong all this time, and she finally knew how the world could be made a good and happy place. This time it was right, it would work, and no one would have to get nailed to anything. Sadly, however, before she could get to a phone to tell anyone about it, a terrible, stupid catastrophe occurred, and the idea was lost forever. This is not her story, but it is the story of that terrible, stupid catastrophe and some of its consequences. It is also the story of a book called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Not an Earth book, never published on Earth, and until the terrible catastrophe occurred, never seen or even heard of by any Earthman. Nevertheless, a wholly remarkable book. In fact, it was probably the most remarkable book ever to come out of the great publishing corporations of Ursa Minor, of which no Earthman had ever heard either. Not only is it a wholly remarkable book, it is also a highly successful one, more popular than the Celestial Home Care Omnibus, better selling than 53 More Things to Do in Zero Gravity, and more controversial than Ulan Kolofid's trilogy of philosophical blockbusters, Where God Went Wrong, Some More of God's Greatest Mistakes, and Who Is This God Person Anyway? In many of the more relaxed civilizations on the outer eastern rim of the galaxy, the Hitchhiker's Guide has already supplanted the great Encyclopedia Galactica as the standard repository of all knowledge and wisdom, for though it has many omissions and contains much that is apocryphal, or at least wildly inaccurate, it scores over the older, more pedestrian work in two important respects. First, it is slightly cheaper, and second, it has the words "Don't Panic" inscribed in large friendly letters on its cover. But the story of this terrible, stupid Thursday, the story of its extraordinary consequences, and the story of how these consequences are inextricably intertwined with this remarkable book begins very simply. It begins with a house. The house stood on a slight rise just on the edge of the village. It stood on its own and looked out over a broad spread of West Country farmland. Not a remarkable house by any means. It was about 30 years old, squattish, squarish, made of brick, and had 4 windows set in the front of a size and proportion which more or less exactly failed to please the eye. The only person for whom the house was in any way special was Arthur Dent, and that was only because it happened to be the one he lived in. He had lived in it for about 3 years, ever since he had moved out of London because it made him nervous and irritable. He was about 30 as well, tall, dark-haired, and never quite at ease with himself. The thing that used to worry him most was the fact that people always used to ask him what he was looking so worried about. He worked in local radio, which he always used to tell his friends was a lot more interesting than they probably thought. It was, too. Most of his friends worked in advertising. On Wednesday night, it had rained very heavily. The lane was wet and muddy, but Thursday morning's sun was bright and clear as it shone on Arthur Dent's house for what was to be the last time. It hadn't properly registered yet with Arthur that the council wanted to knock it down and build a bypass instead. At 8 o'clock on Thursday morning, Arthur didn't feel very good. He woke up blearily, got up, wandered blearily around his room, opened a window, saw a bulldozer, found his slippers, and stomped off to the bathroom to wash. Toothpaste on the brush, so, scrub. Shaving mirror, pointing at the ceiling. He adjusted it. For a moment, it reflected a second bulldozer through the bathroom window. Properly adjusted, it reflected Arthur Dent's bristles. He shaved them off, washed, dried, and stomped off to the kitchen to find something pleasant to put in his mouth. Kettle, plug, fridge, milk, coffee, yawn. The word bulldozer wandered through his mind for a moment in search of something to connect with. The bulldozer outside the kitchen window was quite a big one. He stared at it. Yellow, he thought, and stomped off back to his bedroom to get dressed. Passing the bathroom, he stopped to drink a large glass of water, and another. He began to suspect that he was hung over. Why was he hung over? Had he been drinking the night before? He supposed that he must have been. He caught a glint in the shaving mirror. Yellow, he thought, and stomped on to the bedroom. He stood and thought. The pub, he thought. Oh dear, the pub. He vaguely remembered being angry about something that seemed important. He'd been telling people about it at great length, he rather suspected. His clearest visual recollection was of glazed looks on other people's faces. Something about the new bypass he'd just found out about. It had been in the pipeline for months, only no one seemed to have known about it. Ridiculous. He took a swig of water. It would sort itself out, he decided. No one wanted a bypass. The council didn't have a leg to stand on. It would sort itself out. God, what a terrible hangover it had earned him, though. He looked at himself in the wardrobe mirror. He stuck out his tongue. Yellow, he thought. The word yellow wandered through his mind in search of something to connect with. 15 seconds later, he was out of the house and lying in front of a big yellow bulldozer that was advancing up his garden path. Mr. L. Prosser was, as they say, only human. In other words, he was a carbon-based bipedal life form descended from an ape. More specifically, he was 40, fat and shabby, and worked for the local council. Curiously enough, though he didn't know it, he was also a direct male-line descendant of Genghis Khan, though intervening generations and racial mixing had so juggled his genes that he had no discernible Mongoloid characteristics, and the only vestiges left in Mr. L. Prosser of his mighty ancestry were a pronounced stoutness about the tum and a predilection for little fur hats. He was by no means a great warrior. In fact, he was a nervous, worried man. Today, he was particularly nervous and worried because something had gone seriously wrong with his job, which was to see that Arthur Dent's house got cleared out of the way before the day was out. Come off it, Mr. Dent, he said. You can't win, you know. You can't lie in front of the bulldozer indefinitely. He tried to make his eyes blaze fiercely, but they just wouldn't do it. Arthur lay in the mud and squelched at him. I'm game, he said. We'll see who rests first. I'm afraid you're going to have to accept it, said Mr. Prosser, gripping his fur hat and rolling it around the top of his head. This bypass has got to be built, and it's going to be built. First I've heard of it, said Arthur. Why has it got to be built? Mr. Prosser shook his finger at him for a bit, then stopped and put it away again. What do you mean, why's it got to be built? He said. It's a bypass. You've got to build bypasses. Bypasses are devices that allow some people to dash from point A to point B very fast, while other people dash from point B to point A very fast. People living at point C, being a point directly in between, are often given to wonder what's so great about point A that so many people from point B are so keen to get there, and what's so great about point B that so many people from point A are so keen to get there. They often wish that people would just once and for all work out where the hell they wanted to be. Mr. Prosser wanted to be at point D. Point D wasn't anywhere in particular, it was just any convenient point, a very long way from points A, B, and C. He would have a nice little cottage at point D, with axes over the door, and spend a pleasant amount of time at point E, which would be the nearest pub to point D. His wife, of course, wanted climbing roses, but he wanted axes. He didn't know why, he just liked axes. He flushed hotly under the derisive grins of the bulldozer drivers. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, but it was equally uncomfortable on each. Obviously, somebody had been appallingly incompetent, and he hoped to God it wasn't him. Mr. Prosser said, "You are quite entitled to make any suggestions or protests at the appropriate time, you know." "Appropriate time?" hooted Arthur. "Appropriate time? The first I knew about it was when a workman arrived at my home yesterday. I asked him if he'd come to clean the windows, and he said no, he'd come to demolish the house. He didn't tell me straight away, of course. Oh no, first he wiped a couple of windows and charged me $5. Then he told me. But Mr. Dent, the plans have been available in the local planning office for the last 9 months. Oh yes, well, as soon as I heard, I went straight round to see them yesterday afternoon. You hadn't exactly gone out of your way to call attention to them, had you? I mean, like actually telling anybody or anything. But the plans were on display. On display? I eventually had to go down to the cellar to find them. That's the display department. With a flashlight. Well, the lights had probably gone. So had the stairs. But look, you found the notice, didn't you? Yes, said Arthur. Yes, I did. It was on a display in the bottom of a locked filing cabinet stuck in a disused lavatory with a sign on the door saying, "Beware of the leopard." A cloud passed overhead. It cast a shadow over Arthur Dent as he lay propped up on his elbow in the cold mud. It cast a shadow over Arthur Dent's house. Mr. Prosser frowned at it. "It's not as if it's a particularly nice house," he said. "I'm sorry, but I happen to like it. You'll like the bypass?" "Oh, shut up," said Arthur Dent. "Shut up and go away, and take your bloody bypass with you. You haven't got a leg to stand on, and you know it." All right. Oh, I love this book. So, starting with the actual prologue, and not the frankly far superior Restaurant at the End of the Universe opening line. So starting with this. As a prologue, I cannot decide if I feel this whole thing is unnecessary or not. It does just kind of roll into the first chapter. It could have just been a part of the first chapter. It's the story of a house, and then we go into that house. I suppose you could read the first chapter without it. You'd be skipping some tone and world building stuff, and I suppose that is important as really the bit of chapter 1 we see in this look inside. It doesn't have any of the world building ish sci-fi elements that you might expect, out of a sci-fi book. So we start out talking about the location in the galaxy. This is almost as majestic of a line as we're gonna get in this book. We're looking at things in the grand scope of time and space. Far out in the uncharted backwaters of the unfashionable end of the western spiral arm of the galaxy lies a small, unregarded yellow sun. We're just a tiny little speck in the universe. But then we zoom in. We're talking about people who are unhappy, which is largely what this series is about. So wonderful. Lots of people are mean. Lots of people are miserable. We get a comical angle on one of the most pivotal points in at least Western history. And we zoom in on the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the in-universe book. We're talking about how we have publishing corporations in this galaxy, great publishing corporations. We've got books with silly names, like the Celestial Home Care Omnibus. And who is this god person anyway? And how It is a slightly cheaper book than the one that is objectively superior in terms of knowledge and has the words "Don't Panic" inscribed on the front, which is what every character in the series really needs. And then we jump down onto Earth, that tiny, insignificant speck, into Arthur Dent's house. And for 1979, this was far more acceptable than it would be today, the slowness of all of this. This was pretty much par for the course in 79. You can't quite get away with that today, but then again, most of us aren't Douglas Adams. Poor Douglas Adams. There's a clip on YouTube of him giving a very serious speech regarding serious sciencey things at a convention, and he asks for questions. He opens up the floor. The first person to pop up asks him some stupid thing. It was like, "Did you remember to bring your towel?" And you can just see the pain and regret on his face as he thinks, "What have I done to the world?" So until the first scene break, the first and only real bit of the absurdity of the series we get are the bits about the bulldozer. We're looking at Arthur Dent a little bit. He's a very nervous man, mostly because people ask him why he's so nervous. He works in the local radio, a little jab at advertising people. This Arthur, this dejected and worried man, he's so set upon by the entire universe. And this is a microcosm of that, as an opening chapter should be. Everybody's just kind of almost passively out to get him. He's just never quite up with dealing with the universe. And in a case like this, he can't have his house because we need to have a bypass instead. This little house makes him happy, and he can't even have that. The bulldozers surround him. He goes out to the pub the previous night. He's ranting, and people just don't care. The glazed looks, it implies dumbness, banality on their part, as well as just not caring. Poor Arthur. And then we get the appearance of the sort of pattern of the intersection of the comically banal descriptions of things, which a more self-important author might handle far more solemnly. Mr. L. Prosser, he is the beginning of this pattern. A 40, fat, and shabby man who works for the local council. This guy he's just a lowest level civil servant. Maybe not lowest level, very low level civil servant dude. And also a direct male line descendant of Genghis Khan, a guy who in another book might have been the main character and protagonist because of this rich bloodline. But this is Douglas Adams. This is Hitchhiker. And so, intervening generations, racial mixing had so juggled his genes. He's just got a bit of a tummy and a predilection for little fur hats and for axes above the door. This guy, who might have been a protagonist in another story, in this world, he has nothing more important to do than to convince a guy to get out the way so he can bulldoze down his house. And that just purely sets the tone for everything that we're going to see going forward. And we see the indignity to which the universe subjects Arthur in the workman who takes his money and wipes the windows a little bit and then says, "Yeah, I'm gonna demolish your house." Like, who would do that? Nobody would have it done to them except for Arthur. And as well, for some reason, this is my favorite bit in the entire series. This whole bit with him trying to get to the plans and it just being so stupidly put out of the way. Like, in a way, you can almost feel the just lack of caring that went into this. It almost doesn't even feel malicious. It's almost a pure laziness on their part, just not wanting to have to deal with people, just not wanting to have to deal with things getting done. Just drips with wry British exasperation. It's amazing. And at least for a book or two, this series lives up to the grand absurdity promised in the opening that we see here. It's a style nearly unique to Adams. I think Terry Pratchett managed to adopt and maybe even improve upon Adams's sort of style. Aside from the two of them, though, really nobody has managed to match or surpass Adams, in my opinion, in this ridiculously absurd style. He plies it majestically, at least for a book or two. Thank you for joining us today. Please leave a comment below with books that you think have great openings that give a great picture of what is to come, or even books that were great but had maybe not so great openings. Both of those are important for us to look at. And if you would hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, you would be doing me a tremendous favor. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.